The rain had been falling for 3 days straight, turning the small town of Millfield into a muddy mess. Sarah walked carefully down Main Street, her worn shoes slipping on the wet pavement. At 17, she had learned to keep her head down and avoid eye contact with most people in town. Her clothes were clean but old, patched in several places by her own careful hands. Sarah lived with her grandmother in a tiny house on the wrong side of the railroad tracks. Her parents had died in a car accident when she was 12, leaving her with nothing but debt and a grandmother who worked double shifts at the local diner just to keep food on the table. Most kids her age were thinking about prom and college applications. Sarah was thinking about her part-time job at the grocery store and whether they could afford to fix the leaking roof. As she turned the corner near the town square, Sarah heard familiar laughter. Her heart sank. There, standing under the awning of Peterson's hardware store, were Madison Clark and her group of friends. Madison was everything Sarah wasn't: wealthy, popular, and cruel. Her father owned the biggest construction company in 3 counties, and Madison never let anyone forget it. "Well, look what the storm washed up," Madison said loudly, making sure her voice carried. "Sarah, the charity case." Sarah tried to walk faster, but the sidewalk was slippery, and she stumbled slightly. This only made Madison's group laugh harder. "Careful there, Cinderella," called out Jake Morrison, Madison's boyfriend. "Wouldn't want you to mess up your designer outfit." The group erupted in laughter at his sarcasm, since everyone could see Sarah's clothes were far from designer anything. Sarah's face burned with embarrassment, but she kept walking. She had learned long ago that fighting back only made things worse. In a small town like Millfield, reputation meant everything, and hers was already at the bottom. "Hey, I'm talking to you." Madison's voice had an edge to it now. She stepped off the sidewalk, blocking Sarah's path. "It's rude to ignore people, you know. Didn't your grandmother teach you any manners?" "Oh wait, she's too busy serving coffee to actually raise you properly." Something inside Sarah snapped. Her grandmother was the kindest, hardest working person she knew, and hearing Madison insult her was too much. "Leave my grandmother out of this," Sarah said quietly, but firmly. "She's worth 10 of you." Madison's eyes flashed with anger. She wasn't used to anyone talking back to her, especially not someone like Sarah. "Excuse me? Did the little orphan just grow a backbone?" Madison stepped closer, her friends forming a circle around them. "You think you're better than us? Look at yourself. You're nothing. Your parents were nothing. That's why they left you with nothing." Sarah's hands clenched into fists. She could feel tears starting to form, but she refused to let them fall in front of these people. "At least I know what it means to work for something," Sarah replied, her voice stronger now. "At least I don't need my daddy's money to feel important." The words hit their mark. Madison's face went red with rage. She looked around at her friends, who were watching with anticipation. She couldn't let someone like Sarah embarrass her in front of everyone. "You want to talk about work?" Madison said, her voice dangerous. "Let me show you what real work looks like." Before Sarah could react, Madison shoved her hard. Sarah stumbled backward, her feet slipping on the wet ground. She fell hard, landing in the massive puddle that had formed where the old storm drain was clogged. The muddy water soaked through her clothes instantly, and she felt the cold, dirty water seep into her shoes and socks. Madison's friends burst into laughter, some of them pulling out their phones to record. Sarah tried to get up, but the puddle was deeper than it looked, and her hands kept slipping in the mud. "Looks like you found where you belong," Madison said, standing over her. "In the gutter with the rest of the trash." Sarah finally managed to pull herself out of the puddle, but the damage was done. Her clothes were ruined, covered in mud and dirty water. Her hair was dripping, and she could taste the gritty water in her mouth. The small crowd that had gathered was either laughing or staring with pity, and Sarah couldn't decide which was worse. "Maybe next time you'll remember your place," Madison said, turning to walk away with her friends. "Come on, guys. Let's go somewhere that doesn't smell like failure." Sarah stood there in the middle of the street, shivering and humiliated. A few people walked by, some shaking their heads in disapproval at what they'd witnessed, but no one stopped to help. That was the way things worked in Millfield. The Clarks had money and influence, and people like Sarah just had to accept whatever happened to them. Mrs. Henderson from the flower shop finally came out with a towel. "Here, dear," she said kindly. "Let me help you clean up." Sarah took the towel gratefully, but she was too embarrassed to speak. She mumbled a thank you and started the long walk home, leaving muddy footprints behind her. When she finally reached her grandmother's house, she found Grandma Rose waiting on the porch. The older woman took one look at Sarah's condition and immediately wrapped her in a warm hug, not caring about getting dirty herself. "What happened, honey?" Grandma Rose asked gently, leading Sarah inside. Sarah told her everything, the words tumbling out between sobs. She talked about Madison's cruelty, about feeling like an outsider, about being tired of being treated like she didn't matter. Grandma Rose listened without interrupting, then helped Sarah into dry clothes and made her a cup of hot tea. When Sarah was finally calm, her grandmother sat down beside her. "Sarah, honey, I need to tell you something," Grandma Rose said, her voice serious. "Something I should have told you a long time ago." Sarah looked up, confused by the strange tone in her grandmother's voice. "Your parents, they didn't leave you with nothing like that horrible girl said. There's something you need to know about who you really are, about where you come from." Sarah's heart began to race. "What do you mean?" Grandma Rose went to the old wooden chest in the corner of the living room, the one Sarah had always been told contained just old photographs and documents. Her grandmother pulled out a key from around her neck and opened the chest with shaking hands. "Your mother made me promise to wait until you were 18 to tell you this," Grandma Rose said, pulling out a thick folder and several official-looking documents. "But after what happened today, I think you're ready to know the truth." Sarah watched as her grandmother spread the papers on the kitchen table. There were legal documents, bank statements, and what looked like property deeds. The numbers on the bank statements made Sarah's eyes widen in disbelief. "I don't understand," Sarah whispered. "Your parents weren't poor, Sarah. They were very wealthy. Your father inherited a fortune from his family, and your mother had her own successful business. When they died, everything was supposed to go to you, but there were complications." Grandma Rose pointed to one of the legal documents. "Your parents' lawyer was corrupt. He stole almost everything and made it look like your parents had died in debt. I've been fighting the courts for 5 years, but I'm just an old woman without money for fancy lawyers." Nobody believed me. Sarah stared at the papers, trying to process what she was hearing. "So we're not really poor?" "The lawyer died last year, and his replacement found evidence of what he'd done. These papers came in the mail 3 days ago. Sarah, you're not just wealthy, you're one of the richest young people in the state. The stolen money, plus 5 years of interest and penalties, comes to over $12 million. Sarah felt the room spinning around her. $12 million? It didn't seem real. "There's more," Grandma Rose continued. "Your family owned businesses, properties, investments. The Clark Construction Company? They've been using your family's land for their biggest projects without paying rent for 5 years. They owe you hundreds of thousands of dollars in back payments." Sarah looked down at her muddy clothes, then back at the documents on the table. The girl Madison had just humiliated and called worthless was actually wealthier than Madison's entire family. "Why didn't you tell me before?" Sarah asked. "Your mother made me promise to let you have a normal childhood, to understand the value of hard work and kindness before you learned about the money. She grew up wealthy and saw how it changed people, made them cruel and entitled. She wanted you to be different." Sarah thought about Madison's behavior, about how money had made her feel superior to everyone else. She understood why her mother had wanted to protect her from that. "What happens now?" Sarah asked. Grandma Rose smiled. "Now, my dear, you get to decide what kind of person you want to be. You have the power to change things, not just for yourself, but for this whole town. The question is, what are you going to do with it?" Sarah looked out the window toward downtown Millfield, where Madison Clark probably thought she had won another victory over someone she considered beneath her. Madison had no idea that the girl she'd just thrown in the mud was about to become the most powerful person in town. Sarah picked up the bank statements and read the numbers again. $12 million. Enough to change everything. Enough to show people like Madison what real power looked like. But, as she sat there, Sarah remembered the feeling of cold mud soaking through her clothes, the sound of laughter as people recorded her humiliation. She thought about all the other kids in town that Madison and her friends picked on, all the families struggling to make ends meet while the Clarks got richer. Money was power, but what mattered was how you used that power. Sarah looked at her grandmother and smiled. I think it's time Madison Clark learned what it really means to mess with the wrong person. The next morning, Sarah woke up feeling different. The knowledge of who she really was had settled into her bones overnight, but she wasn't ready to reveal everything yet. She had a plan, and it required patience. Sarah dressed in her usual simple clothes and walked to school as if nothing had changed. The video of her being pushed into the mud had already spread across social media, and she could hear whispers and snickers as she walked down the hallway. Madison's friends were still laughing about it, making loud comments about Muddy Monday whenever Sarah passed by. During lunch, Sarah sat alone in the library and used the computer to research everything she could about her family's holdings. What she discovered made her gasp. The documents her grandmother had shown her were just the beginning. Her family owned the land under half the businesses in downtown Millfield. They owned the shopping center where most kids hung out. They even owned the land under Millfield High School itself. More importantly, she learned that Clark Construction had been using her family's prime real estate for their equipment storage and main office building for the past 5 years without paying a single dollar in rent. The contract they'd been operating under had expired shortly before her parents died, and, in the chaos of the legal troubles, no one had enforced the rental payments. Sarah did the math. At current market rates, Clark Construction owed her family over $300,000 in back rent, plus penalties. That was more than most families in Millfield made in 10 years. But Sarah wasn't interested in just collecting money. She was interested in justice. After school, Sarah walked to the offices of Whitman and Associates, the law firm that had contacted her grandmother about the recovered inheritance. The secretary looked surprised to see a teenager walk in alone. "I'm here to see Mr. Whitman about my inheritance case," Sarah said calmly. Sarah Mitchell. Within minutes, she was sitting in a plush office across from David Whitman, a man in his 50s who had been working for months to untangle the mess left by his predecessor. "Sarah, I'm so glad you came in," Mr. Whitman said. "I've been looking forward to meeting you. I have to say, your case is one of the most egregious examples of legal theft I've ever seen. We're going to make sure you get everything that's rightfully yours." "I want to know about Clark Construction," Sarah said directly. "They've been using our land without payment, haven't they?" Mr. Whitman nodded grimly. "That's correct. When your parents' estate was frozen, Clark Construction just stayed. They'd been operating their main facility on your property without authorization. Technically, they're squatters. What are my options?" "Well, you could demand immediate payment of back rent, which would be approximately $320,000. Or you could evict them immediately. Or..." Mr. Whitman smiled slightly, "You could do both." Sarah leaned forward. "Tell me more about eviction." "With 30 days' notice, you can terminate their use of the property. They'd have to move their entire operation, which would probably cost them millions and take months to relocate. It would effectively shut down their business for the rest of the year." Sarah thought about Madison's cruel words, about her father's arrogance, about all the families they'd looked down on while building their wealth on stolen land. "I want to give them a choice," Sarah said. "They can pay what they owe plus damages, or they can leave. But I want to be the one to deliver the message." Mr. Whitman looked surprised. "Are you sure? This kind of thing is usually handled through legal channels." "I'm sure," Sarah said firmly. "But I want you there as my legal representative. Can we set up a meeting with Richard Clark tomorrow?" The next day, Sarah walked into Clark Construction's main office building, the building that, she now knew, sat on her family's land. She was wearing her usual simple clothes, and the receptionist barely looked up when she entered. "Excuse me," Sarah said politely. "I need to speak with Mr. Clark about a legal matter regarding this property." The receptionist finally looked at her and smirked. "Honey, this is a construction office, not a high school guidance counselor. If you're looking for a job application, you need to go around back." Just then, Mr. Whitman walked in wearing an expensive suit and carrying a briefcase. "I'm here with my client for our appointment with Richard Clark." The receptionist's attitude changed immediately. "Of course. Right this way, sir." She led them to a conference room where Richard Clark was waiting. He was a large man with silver hair and expensive clothes, the kind of person who was used to being the most important person in any room. When he saw Sarah, his expression shifted to confusion. "David, I thought you said you were bringing your client," Richard said. "Is this someone's daughter?" "Mr. Clark," Mr. Whitman said formally, "I'd like you to meet my client, Sarah Mitchell." Richard Clark's face went pale. Sarah watched as recognition dawned in his eyes. He knew exactly who the Mitchell family was. "Sarah is here to discuss the unauthorized use of her property," Mr. Whitman continued, placing a thick folder on the table. "This building, your equipment yard, and your main storage facility are all located on land owned by the Mitchell estate." Sarah spoke for the first time. "Hello, Mr. Clark. I believe you know my daughter Madison." Richard Clark's jaw tightened. "What exactly do you want?" Sarah opened the folder and pulled out copies of the property deeds and rental calculations. "You've been using my land for 5 years without permission or payment. You owe $320,000 in back rent, plus penalties for unauthorized use." "This is ridiculous," Richard Clark blustered. "We had a contract with the previous property management company." "The contract expired 2 months before my parents died," Sarah said calmly. "You've been squatting on my property ever since." Mr. Whitman slid another document across the table. "This is an eviction notice. Ms. Mitchell is prepared to give you 30 days to vacate the premises." Richard Clark's face turned red. "You can't do this. We employ half this town. Moving our operation would take months." "You should have thought of that before you decided to use someone else's property for free," Sarah replied. "But I'm prepared to offer you a choice." She could see the desperation starting to creep into his eyes. Clark Construction was one of the biggest employers in Millfield, but she knew from her research that they were heavily leveraged. Losing their main facility would destroy the company. "What kind of choice?" Richard asked reluctantly. "Pay what you owe, plus sign a new lease at current market rates going forward. The total amount due immediately is $320,000. The new lease will be $12,000 per month." Richard Clark did the math quickly. The monthly lease payment alone would cut significantly into his profits. The back payment would wipe out most of the company's cash reserves. That's highway robbery," he stammered. "No," Sarah said quietly, "highway robbery is what you've been doing to my family for 5 years. This is justice." She stood up to leave, then turned back. "Oh, and, Mr. Clark? You have 48 hours to decide. If I don't hear from you by Friday at 5 p.m., the eviction notice goes into effect immediately." As they walked out of the building, Mr. Whitman looked at Sarah with admiration. "That was very well handled. You have good instincts for this kind of thing." "I learned from the best," Sarah said, thinking of all the times she'd watched wealthy people in town use their power to get their way. "The difference is, I'm going to use mine for good." That afternoon at school, Sarah noticed Madison and her friends were quieter than usual. Word traveled fast in a small town, and rumors were already spreading that something big was happening with Clark Construction. Sarah was putting books in her locker when Madison suddenly appeared beside her, looking uncharacteristically nervous. "Sarah," Madison said, her voice lacking its usual confidence. "I heard some crazy rumor that you're trying to sue my dad's company or something. That's insane, right?" I mean, your family doesn't have money for lawyers. Sarah closed her locker and looked directly at Madison for the first time since the incident in the mud. My family has plenty of money for lawyers, Madison. We've just been choosing how to use it carefully. Madison laughed, but it sounded forced. Right. Come on, Sarah. This is me you're talking to. I know you can barely afford lunch most days. Do you remember what you said to me yesterday? Sarah asked. About knowing my place? About being in the gutter where I belong? Madison shifted uncomfortably. Look, if you're still upset about that, it was just joking around. You don't need to get all dramatic about it. You're right about one thing, Sarah said. I do need to remember my place. And my place, it turns out, is owning half this town. Madison's smile faltered. What are you talking about? Ask your father, Sarah said, walking away. I'm sure he'll explain everything. That evening, Sarah's phone rang. It was Mr. Whitman. Sarah, Richard Clark has been calling my office all afternoon. He wants to meet again tomorrow. I think you got his attention. Good, Sarah said. But I'm not changing the terms. He pays what he owes, or he loses everything. There's something else, Mr. Whitman said. I've been going through more of your family's holdings. Sarah, you don't just own the land under Clark Construction. You own significant portions of downtown Millfield, including several buildings that house other businesses. Your family was essentially the silent landlord for a large part of this town. Sarah absorbed this information. With great power came great responsibility, and she was beginning to understand just how much power she actually had. What about the other businesses? Are they current on their rent? Most of them are, yes. The management company that was handling your properties kept collecting rent from everyone except Clark Construction. Apparently, Richard Clark convinced them he had some sort of special arrangement. So he knew he was supposed to be paying rent? Oh, he definitely knew. We have emails proving he was told multiple times that his free period had ended. He just chose to ignore it because he thought a young girl and her grandmother wouldn't be able to fight him. Sarah felt a surge of anger. It was one thing to be cruel to her at school. It was another thing entirely to steal from her family while they struggled to pay bills. Mr. Whitman, I want you to prepare for every legal option we have. If Mr. Clark doesn't agree to our terms tomorrow, I want to hit him with everything. Are you sure, Sarah? This could destroy his business. Sarah thought about her grandmother working double shifts at the diner, about all the nights she'd gone to bed worried about money, about all the families in Millfield who struggled while people like the Clarks got rich by cheating. He should have thought about that before he decided to steal from an orphan, Sarah said. He picked the wrong family to mess with. As she hung up the phone, Sarah realized that tomorrow would change everything. One way or another, the balance of power in Millfield was about to shift dramatically. And Madison Clark was about to learn what it really meant to mess with someone who had nothing left to lose. Friday morning arrived with clear skies, a sharp contrast to the storm that had started everything just 4 days earlier. Sarah dressed carefully, choosing clothes that were simple but clean. She wasn't ready to reveal her new status to the whole town yet, but today would mark the beginning of major changes. At school, she noticed Madison looked exhausted, with dark circles under her eyes. The confident, cruel girl who had pushed her into the mud seemed to have disappeared, replaced by someone who kept checking her phone anxiously and jumping every time it rang. During first period, Madison's phone buzzed with a text message. Sarah watched as Madison's face went white after reading it. A few minutes later, Madison raised her hand and asked to be excused to the nurse's office. Sarah knew exactly what that text message had said. Mr. Whitman had informed her that Richard Clark had until 5 p.m. that day to respond to their demands, and the deadline was making the whole Clark family nervous. At lunch, Sarah finally saw the full extent of how worried Madison had become. Instead of sitting with her usual crowd, Madison was alone at a corner table, staring at her untouched food. Her friends were at their regular table, talking in hushed whispers and occasionally glancing over at her. Sarah made a decision. She walked over and sat down across from Madison. "You look like you're having a rough day," Sarah said quietly. Madison looked up, and, for the first time since Sarah had known her, there was no cruelty in her eyes. Just fear and confusion. "Sarah, I need to ask you something, and I need you to tell me the truth," Madison said. "Are you really trying to destroy my family?" Sarah studied Madison's face. The girl who had called her worthless and pushed her into the mud was gone. In her place was a scared teenager who was finally facing the consequences of her family's actions. "Your family destroyed itself," Sarah said. "I'm just collecting what's owed to me." Madison's eyes filled with tears. "My dad won't tell me what's happening, but I can hear him on the phone all night. He keeps talking about losing everything. I heard him tell my mom we might have to sell our house." Sarah felt a flicker of sympathy, but she remembered her grandmother working double shifts while Richard Clark got rich using their land for free. "Madison, did you know that your father's company has been using my family's property without paying rent for 5 years?" Madison looked genuinely confused. "What property? What are you talking about?" "The land under your father's office building, his equipment yard, his storage facilities. It all belongs to my family. He owes us over $300,000. Madison stared at her. "That's impossible. Your family doesn't own anything." Sarah pulled out her phone and showed Madison a photo of one of the property deeds. "My family owned half this town. After my parents died, a corrupt lawyer stole everything and made it look like we were poor. The truth just came out this week." Madison read the document on the phone screen, her face growing paler with each line. "This says your family owns the land under our house too." Sarah nodded. "Along with about 60% of downtown Millfield." "I don't understand," Madison whispered. "If your family was so rich, why didn't you have nice things?" "Because my grandmother and I believed in earning what we had," Sarah replied. "We didn't know about the money until this week. But even if we had known, we wouldn't have used it to treat people the way your family treated us." Madison was quiet for a long moment. Then, in a voice so quiet Sarah could barely hear it, she said, "I'm sorry about the mud thing. I'm sorry about all of it." Sarah looked at the girl who had tormented her for years. The apology felt genuine, but it was too little, too late. "Madison, do you know what it's like to go to bed hungry because your family can't afford groceries? Do you know what it's like to patch your clothes because you can't buy new ones? Do you know what it's like to be pushed into the mud while people laugh and record it?" Madison shook her head, tears now flowing freely. "Your family got rich by stealing from mine while we struggled to survive. And you used that stolen wealth to make my life miserable because you thought I was beneath you." Sarah stood up. "I am sorry that you're scared. But actions have consequences." That afternoon, Sarah sat in Mr. Whitman's office, waiting for Richard Clark's final answer. At exactly 4:45 p.m., Richard Clark arrived with his own lawyer, a nervous-looking man who kept shuffling papers and avoiding eye contact. "Ms. Mitchell," Richard Clark said, his voice strained, "I want to discuss a payment plan." Sarah exchanged glances with Mr. Whitman, then looked back at Richard Clark. "The terms are non-negotiable. Full payment of back rent plus damages, or immediate eviction." "You don't understand," Richard Clark said desperately. $300,000 in cash would bankrupt my company. I have employees, families who depend on those jobs." "You should have thought about your employees before you decided to steal from my family," Sarah replied. "You've had 5 years to pay what you owed. Instead, you chose to spend that money on other things while my grandmother worked herself to exhaustion." Richard Clark's lawyer leaned forward. "Ms. Mitchell, perhaps we could work out a settlement where Mr. Clark pays half now and the rest over time?" Sarah shook her head. "No payment plans. No discounts. Pay what you owe, or lose the property." "Please," Richard Clark said, and Sarah was shocked to hear the desperation in his voice. "I'm begging you. My daughter doesn't deserve to lose her home because of my mistakes." Sarah thought about Madison's tearful face at lunch, about the fear in her eyes. Then, she thought about all the times Madison had called her worthless, all the times she'd been cruel for no reason other than entertainment. "Your daughter spent years making my life miserable because she thought she was better than me," Sarah said. "Maybe it's time she learned what it feels like to be on the other side." But, even as she said the words, Sarah felt uncomfortable. Was she becoming just as cruel as Madison had been? Mr. Whitman checked his watch. "It's 5 p.m., Mr. Clark. What's your decision?" Richard Clark looked at his lawyer, who shrugged helplessly. Then, he looked back at Sarah. "I'll pay," he said quietly. "I'll pay everything." Sarah felt a mixture of satisfaction and guilt. "All of it? The full amount?" "Yes. I'll liquidate assets, take out loans, whatever it takes. Just please don't evict us." Mr. Whitman began pulling out contracts. "We'll need payment within 7 business days, plus the signing of a new lease agreement." As the lawyers worked out the details, Sarah found herself watching Richard Clark. He looked like a man who had aged 10 years in 1 week. She realized that this moment wasn't really about the money. It was about power, and about showing people like the Clarks that they couldn't treat others badly without consequences. An hour later, all the papers were signed. Richard Clark would pay the full amount owed and begin paying monthly rent that was double what he'd been avoiding. The Clark Construction Company would survive, but barely. As Richard Clark prepared to leave, he turned to Sarah one last time. "I want you to know that I'm sorry. Not just about the money, but about how my family treated you. That was wrong." Sarah nodded. "Tell your daughter that cruelty has a price. And that price usually comes due when you least expect it." That evening, Sarah sat on her grandmother's porch, watching the sun set over Millfield. In her hand was a check for $320,000, more money than she'd ever imagined seeing. Grandma Rose came out with 2 cups of tea and sat beside her. "How do you feel?" her grandmother asked. "Strange," Sarah admitted. "I got what I wanted, but I don't feel as good about it as I thought I would." "Power is a heavy burden," Grandma Rose said. "The question is what you're going to do with it now." Sarah looked at the check again. "I want to use some of this to help other families in town. Families like we used to be." "That sounds like something your mother would have done," Grandma Rose said with a smile. Over the weekend, word spread through Millfield about what had happened. The story got bigger with each telling, and, by Monday morning, everyone at school knew that Sarah Mitchell, the girl they'd all overlooked or pitted, was actually one of the wealthiest people in town. Sarah arrived at school to find students staring at her with a mixture of awe, fear, and newfound respect. Some of the same kids who had laughed when Madison pushed her into the mud were now trying to be friendly, asking if she needed help carrying her books or if she wanted to sit with them at lunch. Madison was notably absent from school that day. During lunch, Sarah sat in the library and used the computer to research local charities and organizations that helped struggling families. She wanted to make sure her newfound wealth would do some good. That afternoon, Jake Morrison, Madison's boyfriend and one of her chief tormentors, approached Sarah at her locker. "Hey, Sarah," he said, trying to sound casual. "I just wanted to say that I think what happened last week was really messed up." Madison was way out of line. Sarah looked at him skeptically. "Last week you were laughing and recording it." Jake shifted uncomfortably. "Yeah, about that. I deleted the video. And I told everyone else to delete theirs too. Because you're genuinely sorry, or because you found out I have money?" Sarah asked directly. Jake's face turned red. "Look, I know how this looks, but, Jake," Sarah interrupted, "I appreciate the apology, but let's be honest. If I was still poor, would you be talking to me right now?" Jake couldn't meet her eyes. "Probably not," he admitted quietly. "At least you're honest," Sarah said. "That's more than most people." As Jake walked away, Sarah realized that money had indeed changed everything, but not in the way she'd expected. People treated her differently now, but it wasn't real respect. It was fear and opportunism. She was beginning to understand why her mother had wanted her to grow up without knowing about the family wealth.
That evening, Madison called. Sarah? It's Madison. Could we meet somewhere and talk?
They met at the town park, the same park where they'd played as little kids before social status and family wealth had divided them into different worlds. Madison looked exhausted, like she hadn't slept in days. My dad told me everything, Madison said. About the land, about the money he owed your family, about why he was so stressed this week.
Sarah waited for her to continue.
He also told me how your family got their money originally. Your great-grandfather started with nothing and built everything through hard work and good investments. He helped other families in town when they needed it. Your family were good people.
What's your point? Sarah asked.
My point is that I'm ashamed, Madison said, tears starting again. Not just about what I did to you, but about who I've become. My family got successful partly by taking advantage of people, and I used that success to be cruel to anyone I thought was beneath me.
Madison looked directly at Sarah. I know saying sorry isn't enough. But I want you to know that I understand now how awful I've been. And I want to be better. Sarah studied Madison's face.
The apology seemed genuine, but Sarah had been hurt too many times to trust easily.
Madison, you didn't just hurt my feelings.
You humiliated me in front of the whole town because you thought I was powerless. You called my grandmother worthless.
You made me feel like I didn't belong anywhere.
I know, Madison whispered.
And I hate myself for it.
They sat in silence for a while, watching the sun set over the small town that would never look the same to either of them.
Finally, Sarah spoke. I'm not ready to forgive you. Not yet.
But I'm willing to see if you really mean what you're saying about wanting to be better.
Madison nodded. What can I do? Sarah thought for a moment. There's a family in town, the Johnsons, whose house is being foreclosed on because the father lost his job after an injury.
I'm going to help them, but I could use someone who knows how to organize fundraising events.
You want me to help you help other people? Madison asked, surprised.
I want to see if the person you're apologizing for really exists, or if this is just because your family needs my money to survive. Madison wiped her eyes and nodded.
I'll do it. Whatever you need.
As they walked home in different directions, Sarah reflected on how much had changed in just 1 week.
She'd gone from being the town outcast to being one of its most powerful residents.
She'd learned that money could buy justice, but it couldn't erase the pain of years of humiliation. More importantly, she'd learned that true power came not from having wealth, but from choosing how to use it. She could use her money to get revenge, to make people who had hurt her suffer the way she had suffered. Or she could use it to make sure that no other kid in Millfield ever had to go through what she'd experienced. Standing on her grandmother's porch that night, looking out over the town that now belonged to her in so many ways, Sarah made her choice. She would be rich, but she would not be cruel. She would be powerful, but she would use that power to lift others up, not tear them down. And maybe, just maybe, she could turn Millfield into the kind of place where a girl's worth wasn't measured by her bank account, but by the kindness in her heart. The girl they had tossed in the mud had risen up to show them who she really was. But, more importantly, she had shown herself who she chose to be.